At 34, Dr. Nora Whitfield had built a life that did not depend on anyone's approval. 5 years earlier, however, her family had erased her with a single phone call. They believed she had dropped out of medical school. They believed she had lied about her grades, fabricated paperwork, and disappeared out of shame. None of it was true. The lie had come from her older sister, Madeline, delivered with calm confidence and carefully selected details. Edward and Margaret Whitfield did not ask Nora for proof. They did not call her Dean. They did not wait for explanation. Within 1 week, they blocked her number, returned her letters unopened, and told relatives she had chosen a different life. Nora had been 3,000 miles away in Portland, on a formal leave of absence from Oregon Health and Science University, caring for a dying friend. By the time she realized what Madeline had done, the story had already hardened into family fact. For 5 years, her parents missed her residency graduation, her wedding, and every milestone in between. They spoke of her in the past tense. Nora stopped trying to correct them. She focused on becoming a surgeon instead. She finished medical school, completed a grueling 5-year surgical residency, and accepted a position at Riverside Regional Medical Center in Connecticut. She did not return home. She built something new. The past remained sealed behind her, unresolved but quiet, until the night her sister was rushed into her trauma bay. Before I continue, I need to ask you a quick favor. We're working toward our first 1,000 subscribers, and your support truly makes a difference. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It's completely free. Like this video, and tell me where you're watching from. That single click helps this channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you stories like this. Growing up in Hartford, Connecticut, there had always been 2 daughters in the Whitfield home, but only one commanded the room. Madeline, 3 years older, was articulate, polished, and socially fearless. She performed in school plays, led student council meetings, and charmed teachers effortlessly. Edward admired confidence and decisiveness. Margaret valued harmony and appearances. Madeline supplied both. Nora was different. She preferred textbooks to parties, science fairs to social gatherings. She was not rebellious or distant, she was simply self-contained. When she qualified for the state science competition in 8th grade, the same weekend Madeline starred in a community theater production, her parents attended the play. Nora returned home with a second-place ribbon and placed it quietly on the kitchen counter. "That's nice," Edward said without looking up from the newspaper. It was not cruelty. It was hierarchy. Nora learned early that achievement did not guarantee attention. She adjusted accordingly. She studied harder, spoke less, and imagined a future where performance did not determine worth. When she was accepted into Oregon Health and Science University's medical program at 23, something shifted briefly. Edward read the letter twice. "That's a serious school," he said, meeting her eyes. Margaret called relatives that evening with unmistakable pride. For the first time, Nora felt visible. Across the dinner table, Madeline smiled and congratulated her. The smile held, but something in her expression sharpened. Nora did not recognize it then. She mistook scrutiny for support. She shared details freely, class schedules, professors' names, the structure of clinical rotations. She believed her sister was finally interested in her world. During her 3rd year of medical school, Nora's closest friend, Emily Carter, was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Emily had grown up in foster care and had no immediate family. Nora accompanied her to oncology appointments, learned medication schedules, and slept in a chair beside her hospital bed during chemotherapy cycles. When Emily's condition worsened that August, Nora met with the dean at OHSU and formally requested a 1-semester leave of absence under caregiver status. The paperwork was approved and documented. Her enrollment would resume in January. It was a responsible decision, not an impulsive one. She informed her parents in a brief phone call. Edward sounded distracted. Margaret said they would pray for Emily. Nora also told Madeline, explaining the leave and the plan to return in the spring. Madeline's response was soft and sympathetic. "Take the time you need," she said. "I won't worry Mom and Dad with details." 3 days later, Edward called Nora late at night. His voice was controlled and cold. "Your sister told us you dropped out," he said. "She showed us messages." Nora stood in a hospital hallway outside Emily's room, stunned. "That's not true," she replied. "I filed a leave. I can send the dean's contact information." Edward cut her off. "We won't be lied to." Margaret echoed him through quiet sobs. The call lasted 4 minutes. It ended with a directive: Do not contact them again until she was ready to admit the truth. Within days, her number was blocked. Nora attempted to repair the damage methodically. She sent 2 emails to her parents, attaching official documentation from OHSU, the signed leave of absence, the registrar's confirmation, the re-enrollment date. She included the dean's direct phone number. There was no reply. She mailed a handwritten letter by priority post. It returned unopened, Margaret's handwriting on the envelope instructing the postal service to send it back. Nora called 14 times over 5 days before both numbers were permanently blocked. Desperate, she reached out to Aunt Elaine, Edward's younger sister and the only relative who had consistently treated Nora without comparison. Elaine agreed to intervene. 40 minutes after calling her brother, she phoned Nora back. "He says you've made your bed," Elaine said quietly. The message was clear. Edward believed Madeline. The family closed ranks. Meanwhile, Emily's condition deteriorated. Nora spent her days managing pain regimens and her nights reviewing anatomy notes to prepare for her return to school. When Emily died in December, Nora organized a small funeral attended by 6 people. She stood at the front of a nearly empty chapel and delivered the eulogy herself. There were no relatives present to witness her grief. 2 weeks later, she re-enrolled for the spring semester as planned. She did not call Hartford again. She focused entirely on finishing medical school. She graduated on time at 27. No one from her family attended the ceremony. Nora matched into a 5-year surgical residency in Connecticut, determined to build a career defined by competence rather than validation. Residency was relentless. 12-hour shifts extended into 18. Mistakes were dissected in front of peers. Emotional endurance mattered as much as technical skill. She found a mentor in Dr. Charlotte Briggs, a seasoned trauma surgeon who valued precision over ego. "Surgery isn't about brilliance," Dr. Briggs told her during a difficult rotation. "It's about steadiness." Nora adopted that philosophy. She limited personal conversations, declined invitations to return home for holidays, and avoided checking social media posts from relatives who believed she was unemployed. Through Aunt Elaine, she learned that Madeline had continued the narrative. Nora had refused contact. Nora had abandoned the family. Nora had chosen pride over reconciliation. By the time Nora completed residency at 32, the story had solidified beyond easy correction. She accepted a permanent position at Riverside Regional Medical Center. 2 years later, when Dr. Briggs stepped down, the board appointed Nora as chief of trauma surgery at 34, young for the role, but widely respected for her discipline and outcomes. She married Samuel Hayes in a small ceremony attended by colleagues and Aunt Elaine. An invitation mailed to her parents was returned unopened. Nora placed it in a drawer and moved forward. She did not expect to see her family again, until a winter night when her pager sounded at 3:07 a.m. The pager vibrated against the nightstand at 3:07 a.m., pulling Nora from a shallow sleep. Samuel stirred beside her as she reached for it. Level 1 trauma. Motor vehicle collision. Female, 37. Hemodynamically unstable. ETA 8 minutes. She was on her feet before the message finished scrolling. Years of residency had trained her body to move without hesitation. By the time she reached Riverside Regional Medical Center, the ambulance bay lights were cutting through a thin January fog. Inside the trauma room, nurses prepared blood units while a resident reviewed airway equipment. Nora scanned the preliminary chart on the tablet handed to her by the charge nurse. The name stopped her cold. Madeline Whitfield. Date of birth matched. Emergency contact, Edward Whitfield. For 2 seconds the noise of the emergency department seemed to recede. Then she set the tablet down. "Prep OR2, she said evenly. "Page Dr. Morales to stand by." She documented the conflict of interest immediately in the electronic chart and informed anesthesia that another attending was available if needed. The ambulance doors burst open moments later. Madeline was unconscious, pale beneath streaks of blood, oxygen mask clouded with shallow breaths. Blood pressure was falling. The paramedic reported blunt abdominal trauma and rapid blood loss. Behind the gurney, Edward and Margaret appeared disoriented and frightened. Edward demanded to see the attending surgeon. A nurse redirected them toward the surgical waiting area. Nora did not speak to them. She focused on the patient in front of her. In that room, Madeline was not a sister. She was a critical trauma case with minutes to live. In the scrub room, Nora allowed herself exactly half a minute to steady her thoughts. She reviewed the CT scan images quickly. Probable splenic rupture, possible liver laceration, internal bleeding likely from mesenteric vessels. She informed Dr. Morales of the family connection again and confirmed he would assume control if necessary. Understood, he replied. You're clear to proceed. In the operating room, the team moved with quiet efficiency. Nora opened the abdomen and confirmed the splenic rupture. Blood pooled rapidly. Suction, she said. The spleen was removed. Attention shifted to a grade 3 liver laceration. She repaired it carefully with layered sutures, controlling 2 separate bleeding vessels along the mesentery. The procedure lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. Throughout it, her voice remained calm and precise. Residents observed closely as she navigated delicate tissue without hesitation. At 6:48 a.m., the final stitch was placed. Madeline's blood pressure stabilized. Output was steady. Dr. Morales exhaled behind his mask. That was clean, he said quietly. Nora removed her gloves and washed her hands. The surgical outcome was no longer uncertain. Madeline would survive. The next conversation, however, would not be clinical. Nora stepped into the hallway knowing that her parents were waiting 40 feet away, unaware that the surgeon who had just saved their daughter was the one they had erased from their lives. The waiting room was silent except for the muted hum of a television. Edward stood as Nora entered, mask lowered, identification badge visible. Doctor, he began urgently. How is she? His words faltered when his eyes focused on the name printed beneath her photograph. Dr. Nora Whitfield, MD, Chief of Trauma Surgery. Margaret's hand tightened around his sleeve. Recognition spread slowly across their faces, disbelief overtaking panic. Nora spoke in the measured tone she used with every family. Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield, your daughter sustained a ruptured spleen and a liver laceration. Surgery was successful. She is stable in the ICU. Margaret whispered Nora's name as if testing it. Edward stared at her badge again. You're a surgeon. Yes, she answered simply. I completed medical school and a 5-year residency. I have been at Riverside for 2 years. Silence followed. Nurses at the station nearby understood enough to step back. Margaret moved toward her, arms lifting uncertainly. Nora maintained professional distance. You may see her in about an hour, she continued. Edward's voice was strained. Madeline told us you dropped out. Nora did not raise her volume. That was incorrect. She held his gaze for a moment before excusing herself to check postoperative vitals. Behind her, she heard Margaret's unsteady breath and Edward's stunned silence. Madeline regained consciousness later that morning in the ICU. The monitors beeped steadily as Nora entered for assessment. Madeline's eyes drifted toward the doorway and narrowed as she read the badge clipped to Nora's coat. Confusion shifted into comprehension. Nora, she rasped. You operated on me, Nora confirmed. She reviewed the procedure clinically, splenectomy, liver repair, stable prognosis. Madeline swallowed. You're the chief. Yes. The weight of that answer lingered in the room. After a moment, Madeline attempted to speak again. I can explain, Nora interrupted gently but firmly. This is not the time. Your focus is recovery. Through the glass wall, Edward and Margaret waited, faces pale. When they were allowed inside, Nora stepped aside. She heard fragments of their conversation from the hallway, questions about emails, about blocked numbers, about Auntie Lane's previous warnings. Madeline's responses lacked the confidence they once carried. Nora did not remain to witness the unraveling. Her responsibility had been surgical, not emotional. By midday, the ICU floor had absorbed the news. Staff members understood that the surgeon and the patient shared a last name and a history. Nora continued rounds as scheduled. Professional conduct demanded consistency, and she offered nothing less. The personal reckoning unfolding upstairs would proceed without her participation. That evening, after a 22-hour shift, Nora returned to the ICU for a final check. Edward and Margaret were still there. Margaret's eyes were swollen from crying. Edward appeared older than he had that morning. We were wrong, Margaret said quietly. We should have asked you. Nora listened without interrupting. You had documentation, Edward added, voice unsteady. Elaine tried to tell us. Nora acknowledged the facts calmly. I sent 2 emails and a letter with official paperwork from OHSU. I called 14 times. There was no accusation in her tone, only clarity. Edward lowered his gaze. We believed her. I know, Nora replied. She explained Madeline's recovery plan and follow-up schedule, then prepared to leave. Margaret reached for her hand. This time, Nora allowed brief contact. I need time, she said. If there is going to be any rebuilding, it will require honesty and consistency. Edward nodded slowly, understanding that apology alone would not repair 5 years of silence. Nora walked out of the ICU with steady steps, aware that the truth had finally surfaced, not through confrontation, but through circumstance. The outcome of surgery had saved a life. What it would mean for her family remained uncertain, but for the first time, the narrative no longer belonged to Madeline. The confrontation inside the ICU did not end quickly. Aunt Elaine arrived before noon, having driven from West Hartford after receiving Nora's brief message. "Madeline is stable. You should come." She entered the room without greeting and stood at the foot of the bed. "We're not leaving this unfinished," she said evenly. Edward looked exhausted. Margaret clutched a tissue in both hands. Elaine opened her phone and began reading. She displayed copies of Nora's original emails from 5 years earlier, forwarded to her at the time for safekeeping, complete with attached leave of absence documentation from Oregon Health and Science University. She scrolled further and revealed text messages from Madeline advising her not to confuse Mom and Dad with updates about Nora's residency. Margaret read in silence. Edward turned toward his older daughter. "Did you tell us not to verify?" he asked. Madeline's expression shifted between denial and resignation. "I thought she was exaggerating," she muttered. Elaine's voice remained steady. "You told me to stay quiet so your parents could feel at peace." The room fell silent. Peace had not been the result, distance had. Edward sank into a chair near the window. Margaret began reading Nora's final email aloud, the one sent on the day of her residency graduation. The words were simple, "I'm still your daughter." Margaret's composure broke. Edward did not argue. For the first time in years, no one defended the lie. Nora returned the following afternoon for routine postoperative evaluation. Madeline's vitals were improving, but her demeanor was subdued. The confident composure she once carried had faded into something quieter and more uncertain. "They know everything," Madeline said without preamble. Nora adjusted the 4-line before responding. "Good." There was no satisfaction in her voice, only acknowledgement. Madeline stared at the ceiling. "I was afraid," she admitted after a pause. "When you got into medical school, everything shifted at home. I thought I was losing my place." Nora considered the statement carefully. "You didn't lose anything," she said. "You chose to create a story instead of adjusting to change." Madeline did not argue. She closed her eyes briefly, as though absorbing the weight of that truth. Outside the room, Edward and Margaret waited, no longer defensive but unsettled. Nora completed her assessment and documented progress in the chart. Professional boundaries remained intact. She did not discuss family history with staff, nor did she allow speculation to circulate. By the end of the week, Madeline was stable enough for discharge planning. The physical recovery would take months. The emotional reconstruction would take longer. Nora left the ICU that day aware that saving a life did not automatically repair a relationship. It merely created the opportunity for something new, if all parties were willing to face what had happened honestly. 2 weeks later, after Madeline was discharged, Nora agreed to meet her in a neutral location, a small cafe halfway between their homes. Samuel accompanied Nora but remained seated at a nearby table, reviewing documents while giving them privacy. Madeline arrived early. She looked thinner and less composed than Nora remembered. When Nora sat down, there was no small talk. "Why?" she asked plainly. Madeline did not deflect this time. "Because I didn't know who I was without being the one they praised," she replied. "When you left for Oregon, they talked about you differently. I panicked." The admission was not theatrical. It was direct and stripped of embellishment. Nora listened without interruption. "You tried to revoke my leave," she said calmly. "You contacted the school." Madeline nodded. "They wouldn't speak to me. The dean told me your paperwork was legitimate." Silence settled between them. Nora finally spoke. "I'm not cutting you out. But rebuilding requires action." She outlined clear expectations. Madeline would send a written correction to every family member she had misled. She would acknowledge the lie fully and without qualification. Madeline agreed without negotiation. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. It ended without resolution but with clarity. For the first time in years, there were no competing versions of events, only facts placed plainly on the table. Nora met separately with her parents the following week at their Hartford home. The kitchen table looked unchanged from her childhood, though the atmosphere felt markedly different. Margaret spoke first. "We've started counseling," she said. Edward confirmed it with a brief nod. "We should have verified," he admitted. I was too certain I was right. Nora acknowledged the effort but remained firm. Apologies are meaningful, she said, but consistency will matter more. She explained that trust could not be restored through a single conversation. It would require months, perhaps years, of steady behavior. Edward did not argue. Margaret asked about Samuel and expressed regret for missing the wedding. Nora accepted the acknowledgement without dramatics. She described her work at Riverside, her responsibilities as chief, and the path that had led her there. The information was new to them. They listened closely, as though reconstructing 5 years in reverse. Before leaving, Nora made one final point. If you want to be part of my future, you have to engage with who I am now, not who you believed I was. Edward stood and walked her to the door. We understand, he said quietly. Whether they fully grasped the implications remained to be seen. 3 weeks later, Riverside Regional Medical Center hosted its annual Physician Excellence Gala. The ballroom was filled with administrators, surgeons, and community leaders. Nora stood near the front with Samuel and Dr. Charlotte Briggs, who had formally recommended her for the award. When her name was announced as Physician of the Year, the applause rose steadily from colleagues who had witnessed her leadership firsthand. She accepted the recognition with a brief speech focused on teamwork and resilience. As she concluded, her gaze moved toward the back of the room. Edward and Margaret sat together, invited quietly by Aunt Elaine. They rose with the rest of the audience, clapping with restrained but visible pride. Afterward, Edward approached Samuel first. I should have met you years ago, he said, extending his hand. Samuel accepted it graciously. Margaret embraced Nora carefully, aware that closeness was no longer automatic. The evening did not erase the past, but it marked a public acknowledgement of reality. Nora returned home that night reflective rather than triumphant. Recognition mattered, but it was not the point. The greater shift lay in the fact that her parents had witnessed her life directly instead of hearing it through someone else's narrative. The architecture of deception had collapsed. What replaced it would depend on steady, deliberate effort from all of them. The following Wednesday evening, Madeline sent the email. It was addressed to every relative whose opinion had been shaped by her version of events over the past 5 years, 4 to 7 names in total. Nora did not help draft it. She did not review it before it was sent. The responsibility belonged to Madeline alone. The message was direct. She admitted that Nora had never dropped out of medical school, that the leave of absence had been legitimate, and that she had deliberately misrepresented the truth. She acknowledged contacting the university in an attempt to undermine Nora's standing. She ended with a single sentence: Nora never abandoned this family. I made sure you believed she did. Responses arrived gradually. Some relatives expressed shock. Others apologized for repeating rumors. A few chose silence. Nora read the email once the next morning at her kitchen table while Samuel poured coffee. She did not feel vindicated. She felt settled. The correction was public and irreversible. Madeline had taken the first necessary step without qualification. Trust would not be restored overnight, but the narrative had been corrected in writing. That mattered. Edward and Margaret continued attending counseling sessions weekly. Progress was uneven but measurable. Edward struggled with admitting fault, yet he no longer dismissed difficult questions. Margaret confronted her tendency to prioritize peace over fairness. Nora observed the changes cautiously. She agreed to short Sunday visits at her home, structured and predictable. The first visit was awkward. Edward offered to set the table. Margaret brought a small tin of cookies and placed it on the counter without commentary. Conversation revolved around ordinary subjects: weather, work schedules, neighborhood updates. No one forced emotional declarations. The simplicity felt deliberate. Nora understood that rebuilding required repetition of small, consistent gestures rather than dramatic apologies. She did not rush the process. She also did not withdraw from it. Boundaries were clear: no minimizing the past, no reframing events as misunderstandings. When difficult topics surfaced, they were addressed directly. The atmosphere remained careful but respectful. For the first time in years, interactions felt grounded in present reality instead of inherited assumptions. Madeline began individual therapy as well. During her second meeting with Nora at the cafe, she described examining her own pattern of competition and insecurity. I attached my value to being the impressive one, she admitted. When that shifted, I reacted badly. Nora listened but did not overinterpret. Change would be proven through behavior, not explanation. Madeline followed through on correcting misinformation with extended relatives and refrained from revising the narrative publicly. She did not attempt to recast herself as misunderstood. She accepted discomfort without dramatics. The distance between the sisters remained, but it was no longer hostile. It was measured. Nora did not pretend the past had not happened, and Madeline did not request immediate forgiveness. The conversations stayed factual and restrained. Trust, if it developed, would do so slowly. For now, coexistence was sufficient. At Riverside, Nora's professional life continued uninterrupted. The trauma service expanded under her leadership, and she mentored younger surgeons with the same steadiness Dr. Briggs had once offered her. She did not discuss family matters at work beyond what had already been evident the night of the accident. Her authority was rooted in competence, not personal narrative. When asked about resilience during a departmental seminar, she spoke briefly about documentation, communication, and the importance of verifying information before drawing conclusions. The advice carried professional relevance without revealing personal history. Her colleagues respected the boundary. Nora recognized that her stability no longer depended on reconciliation. It depended on clarity, knowing what she would accept and what she would not. The events of the past year had tested that clarity and reinforced it. She had not needed revenge. She had needed truth. The distinction guided her decisions moving forward. On a quiet Sunday morning in early February, light snow drifted past the kitchen window of Nora's home. Samuel stood by the stove flipping slices of French toast while she set 4 plates on the table. The doorbell rang at 10 sharp. Edward and Margaret stepped inside, removing their coats carefully as though entering unfamiliar territory. Edward carried a carton of orange juice. Margaret offered a tentative smile. The visit unfolded without ceremony. They spoke about simple things: upcoming travel, hospital renovations, neighborhood news. Edward asked thoughtful questions about trauma protocols. Margaret listened closely when Nora described a recent surgical case. There were no exaggerated declarations, no attempts to rewrite history. When breakfast ended, Edward cleared the dishes without being asked. Margaret embraced Nora briefly before leaving. The gestures were modest but genuine. After the door closed, Nora stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Reconciliation had not arrived dramatically. It had emerged through accountability, correction, and sustained effort. The family she had built, with Samuel, with colleagues, with chosen mentors, remained intact regardless of what happened next. The door was no longer locked, but it was no longer unguarded either. Nora understood that belonging did not require surrendering boundaries. It required mutual respect. For the first time in years, she felt neither erased nor defensive. She felt steady. The past had been confronted directly, and the future would proceed on terms defined clearly and calmly. The story did not end with perfection. It ended with structure, honest, deliberate, and earned. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If Nora's journey meant something to you, if you've ever been misunderstood, silenced, or forced to rebuild without the people who were supposed to stand beside you, I hope this reminded you of one thing. The truth does not disappear just because it's ignored. It waits. And when it arrives, it doesn't need to shout. Reconciliation is not always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like 4 plates on a table. Sometimes it looks like accountability instead of apology. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments. Would you have opened the door the way Nora did? Or would you have walked away for good? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and tell me where you're watching from today.